Welcome to the Tax Awareness Show. My name is Shilibo Mutiba. I'm your host. And today in the studio, I've got Botha from WTS, right? Renmere. I pronounce it correctly, right?
That's perfect. That's
Renmere.
fine.
Yes. And I've got Dr. Gumani from EFF, who is a senior researcher, and Matshidiso Lencoasa from Section 27. Welcome, colleagues. I think what we're going to be doing today will really, if you remember that case about fuel levy, if you remember recently in the latest budget 3.0, the Minister of Finance had actually proposed, and it was later passed at the Parliament, where the fuel levy was increased. But then we're going to just sit back and understand. And if you remember, then subsequently EFF took the minister to court, to the High Court to be in particular. So we're sitting with EFF, we're sitting with Botha, and we're sitting with Matshidiso from Section 27, just to understand the whole court case, but also the legislative and budgetary processes around increasing the tax rates. Colleagues, welcome. Let's have a conversation. Let's enjoy. But maybe let me start with you, Dr. Gumani.
Yeah.
What really informed the position for EFF to really take this matter to the High Court, rather taking the minister to the High Court?
Well, thank you very much, Chili Boy, for the invitation, and to my colleagues. We really appreciate the opportunity to make input in your important platform. I think the more we simplify these discussions and make them accessible, the better. If you remember, that court case got very busy and we tend to forget essentially where it started, right?
Yeah.
So where it started, and this is important to remember, we were in the Standing Committee on Finance as a Parliament. As a EFF, we have two members, the Commissars now and the TG of the EFF, Mpile. And we were processing the fiscal framework that was proposed by the Minister of Finance on the second budget, because the first budget was never tabled.
Yeah.
That meeting just came to a stop. 17 minutes later, the Speaker came in and says, no, the Cabinet is not ready. When we were processing the fiscal framework, there was a dispute around the procedure. What was the dispute? The Money Bills Amendment Procedure, which is an act that says, Parliament, you can amend what the Minister of Finance tables, but this is how you do it. The dispute there was that the chairperson who was running the meeting did not put to the committee for a vote a clear statement whether we are amending or we are supporting the fiscal framework. That was the key issue. And that's what led to everyone else saying we are going to go to court. But the contention around that fiscal framework, you're correct, was about a tax increase, particularly on VAT, value-added tax. And the ANC with other parties, they were in support of it, including Action SA. The EFF, DA, and MK were saying they're against the VAT increase. Essentially was being proposed from 15 to 17%, 2 percentage point. Now, one, procedure, but secondly, the increase itself. In that meeting, the EFF immediately said to the chairperson, you are doing this the wrong way. We are going to write to the speaker today because we think that you didn't follow the process. The very same evening, when we got the final report, which now included a statement at the bottom which says the committee accept the proposal by the Minister of Finance on the fiscal framework, right? When we wrote to the speaker, we wrote on two things. Not the politics of whether we support or we're against the VAT increase. The procedure was not followed. But equally, she must not allow the report to be tabled before the National Assembly. That was the following day, right? There are other technicalities around it because there was a time issue. You must table the report before the National Assembly 15 days after the budget was tabled. Those are other complicated technical things. But the bottom line is the procedure was not followed. In that House sitting, if you remember correctly, the EFF member who served in the Standing Committee on Finance, Ms. Mauto, she stood up and said, Speaker, don't allow this report to be tabled because the procedure was not followed. At that time, the technicalities around the VAT issues were not there, right? We're just dealing with the procedure. And the DA agreed that, no, the procedure was not followed. Even when the DA said they're going to court, they were not saying they're going to court on the powers of the minister to increase VAT or not, but on the procedure. Then they went to court about a day or two later, and then people said the EFF joined the DA, but in actual fact, the EFF announced in that sitting when the speaker allowed the report to be tabled to say, we're going to take you to court. So had the DA not gone to court, the EFF was still going to go to court on the procedure. Now, the EFF then goes to court on two issues. One, the procedure. But two, there is an argument which senior counsel advocate Toby make in that submission. The argument is at this point in time, when you look at the Constitution and what it stands for, the decision to then increase VAT from 15 to 17%, given the prevailing economic conditions, it's unjust. That became a new technical submission over and above the procedure, because the procedure was well debated, right? Unfortunately, the minister considered there were other things that were discussed outside the court that led to the court order and the what you call an agreement, right? But the DA had a different submission to the court. The DA submission is that the minister does not have power to impose taxation because the powers to impose taxation are parliament powers. But the minister was saying, no, I've done this before, and parliament can always come back to this bill and pass it later on, but I want to start the new VAT rate of 17% now, which was going to be the 1st of May, 2025. So the DA argument had then two things. One, stop the minister from introducing the VAT increase, which was the EFF argument also, but for different reasons, as I said earlier. But also, we need to have a look at these powers that the minister thinks he has to impose taxation, which we don't think he has. Taxation, like all other legislations, must first be accepted by Parliament. And once Parliament has agreed, then the minister can go ahead. That became two key argument about the VAT increase. So that's why this whole case came about. And people forget that there was one procedure, but two, there was the issue of which side of the VAT are you arguing against its introduction on the 1st of May. But what made this case now seemingly pending, so that we cover that ground and we can talk about it more later, there is a missing part of it. That order did not resolve on whether the Minister of Finance has the powers to impose taxation without Parliament agreeing to it through a bill, which then gets signed as an act later, right? That is still outstanding. That is part B of the DA. But equally important, the ANC has, the EFF has part in it to say that should we consider certain conditions, prevailing socio-economic conditions, before we impose taxation on majority of the poor who may not afford it, the just part of it. And that still need to be resolved at some point, right? So the part B is not as clean as people make it. It's a very complex political conversation that also involves the law, it involves the constitution, but it challenges the powers of the minister and parliament, and it will then situate properly who does what, when, and how does it impact the majority, particularly the working class and the poor. So that conversation that happened earlier in April and later on when there was a court order still has a lot of unanswered questions. Some of them have to be challenged in court, but some of them we have chance to go to parliament and table various legislation to make it tight and clear as to what is it that the Minister of Finance can do and what he can do, and what is it that parliament can do and where it stops, and until a law is signed by a president, should it be implementable or not? When a VAT is at 14% and you say you are increasing it to 15%, is it new taxation? Is it old taxation? Are you amending, adjusting a rate? Is that amendment administrative or new taxation? Those are the questions we need to answer. And they're not squarely on politics alone. They're technical, they're legal, but also everyone must be heard in that point, right? So the part B will be in court, but also society needs to think about these questions much more broadly. What interests me out of all this, Chilibo, is that we're now talking about tax, treasury, public finance, our economy, and who has the power to do what and when. And if you check since that whole budget debacle, that conversation has not stopped.
Maybe let me allow you to expand and bring to the recent court case of fuel levy. Because if you look at the merits, and the legal argument that you guys are pushing, it's similar to that of VAT increase. Maybe take us exactly to what also supported or informed this decision of fuel levy increase.
Well, firstly, we didn't think that the Minister of Finance is going to insist on general taxation that targets the poor. And for the National Treasury and SARS, the principle and the approach which they adopted, where can they get additional money quickly without broader consultation of society, and administratively SARS is in a position to just implement it, right? So the logic for the National Treasury between the fuel levy and the VAT increase are the same. The logic for us to take them to court, more so the EFF this time around, not so much the DA, because they were in a different political environment. They had considered to whatever GNU was doing, they had agreed to that. But the EFF was saying no. If you look at the decision which led to the court order in agreement between the Minister of Finance, the EFF, the DA, and Parliament, we have the same situation here. It's a no-brainer. Hence, when we went to court and the judge says, no, this is a different matter altogether, we were shocked, because we understood it to mean the same thing. Fuel levy, like VAT, is general taxation. We even argued in those papers that if you look at the consequences of fuel levy increase are far much broader than actually VAT, right? Because of the implication that increase will have on food prices, on transportation, and the general standard of living of majority of people. In this instance, leave the poor and the working class, everyone. So the thinking behind that court challenge was that let's not allow the minister to do what we did not allow him to do with the VAT until this legislation passed by Parliament through a democratically elected Parliament where people know they are represented. And then, once that bill is passed with the majority support, the president signed it into law, then the minister can go and impose taxation with the support of Parliament. And that brings to question, when should this bill be processed? Because we know the financial year starts in April, ends in March. And when you start the financial year in April, we need to be ideally in a situation where there are no pending legislation that can be rejected tomorrow. Because if you increase fuel levy, telling us that you will bring the legislation later, what about the situation where now that legislation is rejected? It means me, yourself, Chili Boy, Matshidiso, Louis, we have paid for fuel levy increase. And we can't claim that money back, right? The minister can just say, okay, no, sorry, there's no law in place now, so we're going to reverse back to the old fuel levy increase. So the idea and the pretense by the National Treasury to introduce such serious legislation, taxation, as if there are some small administrative matters, but me and you feel it because we pay that fuel. And when it has a new fuel levy now, it's a different price. Sitting at 21 rand, 22 rand, averaging there, increasing by 51 cents. That is not a small matter. And at some point, society needs to tell the National Treasury what you view as administrative. Fairly so, you are technocrats. To us, it's constitutional matter. Doesn't only end in adjusting minor rates here and there, a fuel levy increasing by 15 cents, 16 cents. That thing, it's serious. People travel 20, 30 kilometers every day to go to work. In average, people are spending plus minus 4,000 on fuel, and then they pay addition to the transport themselves. When they buy food, that food has fuel consideration. If you go to a farm, it starts with fuel because you're driving tractors, you're harvesting, you transport the food from the farm to the warehouse, to the shops, the retail space. Fuel is every part of the entire value chain of our lives. So even if you increase it by just a margin, the implications are huge. So you can then see the disappointment and the shock when the judge says that the minister can continue and increase the rates of diesel and petrol by 16 and 15 cents. We were shocked, right? But that part, I can confidently say it has part B. Because what was dealt with there, it was whether we can stop the minister or not the merits of the case. The merits of the case, similarly to VAT, are going on. right, in court, but must also find expression in societal discussion and in parliament, because the Minister of Finance and the National Treasury, with all the powers, technical expertise, and the prestige that they occupy in society, do not have the powers to impose taxation. The same way they do not have the powers to tell us to stop spending money. They don't have that power. They can, at some point, if you're not spending it properly, do what is called treasury control, which is in the constitution, but it's carefully crafted, not to give the treasury a status of super ministry. We must reject that. We must challenge it every day. And the people who go to the national treasury as employees must know that they are part of government. They are not independent of government, right? They are not the sub. We can discuss the sub at some other time. The Reserve Bank, it's a different animal altogether. But they are not the sub. They are a government department that get mandated by the constitution and the legislation to propose technical things. But the decision to spend, to tax, rests with democratically elected people. Who are those people? Are in parliament, 400 members, who we voted for, must decide how much we're taxing, how much we're spending, where we're spending it, where we're taxing it from.
Okay. Maybe, Louis, let me bring on the technicality and the legal side of proposing. What does the law say when it comes to perhaps making changes around fuel levy? Maybe take us through that.
Yeah, sure. So just to, I think, to tag on to, and Gumani beautifully summed up gave the context. So the legislation which allows for the change or an increase or a decrease for that matter in the fuel levy, and the change in the VAT rate is different. So maybe good if we go a little bit back into history quickly.
Yeah, I think let's do that. Yeah,
I think it'll be useful. So on the VAT side, what we had in 2016, an amendment was made, and it was almost, I can use the word nondescript, it was almost sort of slipped in, where this provision was brought in to state what we have now, which said that the minister can, by way of announcement in the budget, can increase the tax rate. So it applied to all the taxes across the board. I think the only one that hadn't applied at the time, I think, was the state duty. Okay. So in all so Income Tax Act, VAT Act, Skills Development Levy Act, UIF Act, Transfer Duty Act, all of them, he can amend them by way of announcement, subject to the requirement of the legislation being passed within 12 months.
Yeah.
Now, at the time, of course, practically, it wouldn't have been an issue. If we go to 2018, Malusi Gigaba announces the VAT rate increase from 14 to 15%. It's the famous speech where he quoted Kendrick Lamar and said we're going to be all right.
We were not all right.
Right?
We were not all right.
I think he said he's a poet because he just won the Pulitzer Prize, Kendrick Lamar. And but it wasn't an issue because the ANC had the numbers.
Yeah.
They knew they were going to pass it. So the 12-month thing was not an issue. In practice, that legislation was going to get passed. We weren't. This was. It wasn't going to be an issue. So fast forward, and now this is the first GNU budget, and now, of course, the numbers are not there. So everything happened very, very quickly once the rate was announced, and as Gumani explained. But I don't think anyone really saw it coming because no one had thought of the scenario where you did not have an out-and-out majority. A party that had an outright majority in parliament. So now it's not so clear-cut anymore. Okay, so that's why we have that issue, and that's why Part B is very, very important because we need that clarity. I think something that comes out importantly here. Gumani highlighted the socio-economic impact. I think the other problem is the confusion. It's because people are told we can increase the rate. Gumani referred to Treasury's powers and that also. We can increase the rate, but what's the process? And the thing is, no one really, I think, understands. The people that need to understand, the everyday people don't really understand. And it's important because for us to really become a proper democracy, for those things to mean something, for principles like participatory democracy, direct democracy, all these lovely things to mean something, people have to have a say. Those 400 people, as Gumani put it, those 400 people are the ones who have to make the decision. So we need clarity on it. But as he said, the challenge, of course, there is some sense in the timing issue. Sorry. There is some sense in the timing issue because, as he put it, the financial year runs from 1 April to 31 March. So you want clarity before the year starts. there is sense in increasing the VAT rate from 1 April because it ties with the financial year.
Mhm.
But how do you then bring in the process? How do you then facilitate that process so that everything ties together? So that's the issue on the VAT one. On the fuel levy one, it's a little bit different. So the customs and the fuel levy change is dealt with in the Customs and Excise Act. Now, a useful one to look at is to care for the context is if we go back to 2022, when the fuel levy was actually decreased. So, Minister, I think Minister Gorongwana was Minister of Finance then. He gives the budget speech. A day or two later, the Russia-Ukraine conflict breaks out. Oil prices skyrocket. Government thinks, what are they going to do? So they ultimately decide to reduce the fuel levy. Okay, so there were two. There was an initial one, I think, from 6 April, sometime in May, and then there was an end of May, I think, and then there was an extension, I think, up to the end of August to essentially cushion the blow. Now, the interesting thing is, if you look at the Customs and Excise legislation, which deals with the change to the fuel levy, and which was the subject of the EFF challenge in the second High Court application, there are two interesting provisions there. There's one interesting provision which says, but it's not cited in the bills in that year, but it says that the minister is allowed to reduce the fuel levy or to reduce any of the levies or certain levies in the Act if it's in the public interest. Okay. So the reduction, I don't think, is as much of an issue. I suppose
Because it's welcomed.
No, of course. Yes.
It's welcomed.
I mean, there would be, if we want to get really technical, and we don't.
Yeah.
I suppose there's an interesting question as to what about the fiscal framework?
Yeah.
Because we've got those estimates, but the minister has this power to do it in the public interest. Now, we all welcome it, but the numbers will have to balance, I would think. But I don't want to go down that one. But the provision that they cited then in the legislation when they actually passed it was another provision which says that the minister can increase the fuel levy, even though there was a decrease. They cited the provision that said the minister can increase the fuel levy from the date that the draft legislation is tabled in Parliament, which was a strange one. But be that as it may, it was changed. We had the reduction, which we all needed at the time. So coming back to the present day, the issue is that as our legislation stands, if it comes to the VAT rate increase, and then a lot of other legislation, except for the Customs and Excise legislation, the process is different because the legislation is different. Now, maybe one thing to mention, and I'd be interested to hear what Gumani's thought is on that, is that there was a case, and it came up in this debate post budget 1 and 2.0, if I can call them that. There was a case that the Constitutional Court heard, I think, back in 2023. I'm just going to refer to it as the New Africa Judgment. What that case was about, actually interesting facts. Essentially, there was a scheme that was being run by certain diplomats where they were basically trying to abuse the diplomatic privilege that they had, just specifically for alcohol, actually. So they could buy duty-free goods and thereby avoid having to pay the customs. I think it's an excise duty that they avoided.
Yeah.
That was quite a topical one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that case.
But then in the case, there's an important point. So one of the things that happened is that New Africa challenged I think the minister's decision, because what the minister did, he basically, today the privilege or the right or the benefit was still available. The next day it was gone. He just announced, by way of announcement did it. And then they challenged that power. And in that case, what the court said is they said, you must look at the type of tax to determine whether the minister should have the power to decree taxation, essentially. So I think, we weren't in court and there's no judgment, but from an outsider's perspective, when I looked at these two cases, it seemed like that would have been the basis on which the High Court would have looked at the cases differently. They would have said that, okay, Part B still has to come, so maybe we shouldn't jump the gun. But why the VAT issue was a bit different. VAT, the specific provision in the VAT Act deals with it one way. Customs and Excise, a fuel levy in the Customs and Excise legislation, we have the New Africa case. There's a principle here, we apply it. So that seems to be the difference between the two cases. Yeah.
Okay, maybe Matshidiso, let me bring you here. When the fuel levy increase was announced, what was the reaction from your end, particularly being those that actually deals with the ordinary people that, as EFF has alluded, that will be most likely being the ones being affected by this introduction of fuel levy increase, particularly the hawkers, particularly those who are using public transport for that. I mean, he announced that the transport cost kicks in, the increase in transport costs kicks in as soon as this fuel levy increase were announced. What were your reaction and the thinking when you heard the announcement around the fuel levy increase?
Sure, thank you very much. So yes, I'm at Section 27, but I also wear the hat of Chairperson of the Budget Justice Coalition.
Correct.
So I might not give the technical legal answers, because sometimes I think when people think Section 27, I might come here with legislation, but I'm more I'm more on the economic side and how we can build an economy that actually works for people in this country. So I think there had been so much focus and especially political focus around a VAT increase this entire year. I think people in this country were actually quite shocked at the state of National Treasury and how far it had gone, to the point where the finance minister could announce a VAT increase, was intending on announcing a 2% VAT increase, whereas the year before, last year, Treasury had made it very clear that they will not increase VAT because it won't generate, they've tried it before, it didn't work, and they're going to do it again. So I think everyone was quite surprised. We expected the same old budget every year, where they complain that there's not enough money because of our debt servicing costs. We pay too much interest, so we're going to cut expenditure. And then we had this VAT increase, and then that became a focus for a while. And then I think people were relieved that the VAT increase was scrapped, and not realizing that, yes, the VAT increase has been scrapped, but they threw in something there with this fuel levy increase, right? And I think what Dr. Gumani had said, that the fuel levy and VAT, our view, especially in the Budget Justice Coalition, is that it is almost like one and the same, in the sense that these are indirect taxes. And so the lower your income is, or not indirect, rather it's a blanket tax. So it's charged at a specific rate. So it doesn't actually matter what your economic position is, or it doesn't account for, for justice. It's not really looking at the budget from a way that can actually advance justice and actually build an economy that works, that can be a redistributive tool, any of those things. It just seemed like the easiest way to make money, right? Which is a problem, because that's not how we should be that's not how we should be making decisions on taxes, economic decisions, because we're supposed to be here trying to build an economy that works and improve the livelihoods and secure the futures of people in our country. But what we end up having, it seems that Treasury is like, oh, okay, if we can't get VAT, we're going to get a fuel levy. And the other issue that we had with the fuel levy is how much it is set to generate this year. So we calculated it's about 4 billion rand. And our view as the Budget Justice Coalition is 4 years. In fact, since 2018, since the first VAT increase, we've shown that there are alternatives. There are ways to tax, there are ways to spend revenue, like this revenue in our country, to spend it in a way that actually foregrounds the rights and the lived experiences of people in this country. There's so much, illicit financial flows. There's so much money that's leaving the country, so much criminal activity that's just gone unnoticed. And for that, and also a lot of decisions that are being taken, financial decisions that are not really thinking long term. So you have a lot of debt that South Africa is taking on. Even now, there've been announcements that South Africa has won or has successfully attained a World Bank loan. And it's like, do you know the impact that has on, on the everyday person? But they don't really think of it that way. And then when it's budget time, they realize, oh, we don't have enough money because we've eroded our public sector. We've eroded, people are struggling, and so they're now trying to think, okay, what else can we do? What have we tried? We've tried fuel levy in the past. We've tried VAT. And so it seems like they don't have many options, but the problem is they actually do. And I think that it's more to do with I mean, on the first hand, yes, it is to do with Treasury being perceived as, or perceiving itself as this supranational department that's not part of government, and it doesn't work in like collectively, not just our fiscal policy, but also like with the social policy, but also with the rest of our economic policy. It doesn't seem that our economic policy is in the interest of addressing the issues that we have of our poverty, our inequality, and unemployment in our country, which is also radicalizing everyday people. And it's not surprising then that people would vote differently, and they want to see different representation in parliament, because they actually want, I think the site of struggle for the majority of people of our country is at the economy, and people want to see some shift. And to see a VAT increase in that way just showed like the out of touch nature of our policy, because people are saying one thing, like we want to address unemployment and inequality, but at the same time we have, and poverty as well, but then you also have a government that says, you know what, we're actually going to increase VAT by 2%, or we're going to increase the fuel levy. So I think to just sum it up, also to just say that the fuel levy, even though it only raises 4 billion rand, it has a more devastating impact especially for job seekers, of which the majority of young people are. Most of the SRD grants and the money that young people have is actually going towards job seeker costs, which I think our comrades at Youth Capital have done a great job of illustrating. So most of the money that people actually have, like the economically vulnerable people have, is going towards looking for jobs. So paying for your taxi fare or whatever it is, so that you can go into the city and at least try to find a job. And so when you make that more expensive, but then the unemployment, they're not really addressing unemployment. They're not addressing this. It just seems like another way for people in this country to suffer, but it doesn't have to be like that. Like I said, I think we emphasize that point, is that it is 4 billion, and there are ways. And as the Budget Justice Coalition, we have constantly shown examples of ways that we can actually raise funding in South Africa in a way that actually advances the livelihoods of people. It doesn't have to be that people have to spend 4 billion. I think we can find 4 billion in our budget.
I mean, speaking of 4 billion, I mean, it comes at a cost. And you probably seen this. I mean, the fuel levy has already been introduced. I mean, we're incurring it on a daily basis now. What has been changed practically? What are you guys seeing? Are you guys tracking any impact that this fuel levy end up having? What has been changes since it's been introduced, the fuel levy increase?
Yeah, so for us, our tracking has been engaging with communities directly. So we've been doing engagements. We just come back from the Eastern Cape. So we were in Nompumelelo informal settlement, and we were also in Makanda, where we were just discussing with people, these are the budget decisions. How has this been affecting really what Treasury should be doing, honestly, And what we found is people are reiterating that even though taxis did say they're not going to increase prices because of the fuel levy, well, I mean, the reality doesn't really say that, that's the first thing. And things were already so expensive, but I think we're seeing it also with the school nutrition program as well. So school feeding is a constitutional right. It's one of the programs that government is also so proud of. But if you look at the money that's allocated towards the school nutrition program, it doesn't actually go towards as far as it should, because there's a lot of, like, I think we spend about like R3.50 on average per meal per learner in the country, but then it becomes more expensive because fuel, the cost of fuel has gone up, and fuel costs are like one of the components of this. How much does it cost to feed a child in South Africa in the school program? So I think that it is definitely impacting nutritional outcomes. I think we're going to see that more over the long term, but I think people on the ground, like people in communities, have already expressed that it's already impacting the access to traveling, like to get jobs. And then I think you also mentioned about like hawkers. So many people, I think the majority of people in this country are located in the informal economy. So you get lots of people who provide the food that supports the formal economy, like the mining or whatever, like who feed the miners. But those, like that's just like one example of the economy in South Africa, the two-tier economy. But what we're finding is that because of the fuel levy, the input costs, and even just the announcements of that, it also gives retailers a right to be like, oh, we're anticipating that things are going to be expensive. So they start reacting to that. And so you're seeing like the price of food, like street food has actually gone up. And I think the other thing is that while, the VAT increase would have generated more than a 4 billion of a fuel levy, though, I mean, it's also debatable for us because we then do there's also like reduction of economic participation, which is what we saw in 2018. So things got more expensive, people spent less. And in communities, I think in Limpopo, a lot of people are saying it's not by choice, like they can't because they can't afford it. I think the difference though with the VAT increase is that there's also like, as much as it sucks and we're completely against it, so I'm not making a case for it, but there was an introduction to zero rate certain things like chicken livers, which are also part of the school nutrition program and other, basic nutrition. But with the fuel levy, there is no zero rating. Like they're trying to get as much as they possibly can from a specific demographic, and so I think it doesn't have the same relief. So, I think we actually spoke about it could, because of international pressures, like fuel prices can go up, can go down, but the fuel levy, like they're committed to increasing it. Like they need to get that amount, which we, again, we say it's not that much, but it doesn't provide relief for people. So there's no reflection on or human rights impact assessments or impact assessments on, okay, we're increasing this to get this 4 billion, but what cost does it come at?
Earlier on, and I'll allow you, Louis, to come in. Earlier on, Dr. Gumani, you mentioned that in your part B, there's an element political side of it. And it comes out here. That sounds like the socio-economic impact, it didn't really get representation during the budgetary processes. And, you can hear from here that the fuel levy, as much as is going to raise this 4 billion, but it doesn't really take into account or provide the reliefs that the VAT, earlier on the VAT, VAT increase came together with additional items that were added into the zero rated list. Therefore, there's that element of not being represented. From EFF point of view, what would you like to see changing within these budgetary processes to ensure that the very same Part B issue, the political issue, is really, really taken into account and considered as one of the significant variables to be considered towards coming up with a budget for the country?
Yeah. Louis made an important point and an effort to be historical about how he was bringing the technical changes that happened to the legislation, right? And you get a sense that things get smuggled in a lot. And they were being smuggled in a lot when the ANC had majority numbers in the National Assembly who could pass effectively any legislation of cabinet, right? Once the cabinet says this is our bill, it goes through. And what you find is that in the past 30 years, there's been a very little movement on private member bills. These are bills that are generated by members of parliament. Majority of the bills that have been passed in the National Assembly have been bills of cabinet. That parliament seemingly exists to pass bills of cabinet, right? That's a historically important point. But I want to even go further, historically. So when you look at 1994, the legislation which brings about this conversation is the PFMA. The PFMA is the one which gives the National Treasury its founding powers. It defines the National Treasury and it explains the reach that the department has. But many people may not remember. The PFMA, initially it was not called the PFMA. It was called Treasury Control. Read it literally. Don't read it with some technical underlying nuances of trying to justify something that does not exist. Treasury control simply, okay, let's remove treasury control, let's just say Gumani control. Right? Makes sense.
Yeah.
So
Gumani control.
The decision to change it to PFMA has some scholarly merits. There were new discussions that were happening around the new school of public management, democratizing administration, but the treasury was opportunistic. It changed the name, it did not change the intent. There was one meeting in 1999 in Parliament, chaired by Barbara Hogan, Trevor Manuel was still the Minister of Finance. I told you Matshidiso about it.
Is that the one you wrote the article about? Because I saw you.
Yeah.
Sorry, I mean to interrupt, but it's a very good piece.
Yeah.
I just
So
thought I
there's
should-
an
yeah.
idea that this treasury exists under an idea that it should be given enough powers to decide on fiscal policy throughout the end without any interruption, because with that power, there will be certainty. That's what Trevor Manuel was going for. And I'm glad it's in writing, verbatim, what he said, right? So that you don't accuse me of making these things up. But the constitution that was adopted in 1996 does not allow those powers, does not give any department, anyone outside parliamentary processes to decide, because our constitution is founded on principle of elected proportionality, democratic representation in that seat of parliament in Cape Town. Now, to answer your question, what must change? Firstly, we have to go back to understanding this principle, that it is not the treasury that should have the powers to decide throughout the drafting, the technical planning, and eventually the tabling of the budget. They wanted it to even go further to deciding that this is the fiscal framework, this is the fiscal policy, this is how it must be implemented. The same way we're treated with monetary policy. With monetary policy, we can debate it. But the governor stand up and says, this is how we're going and this is how we go. And he has a good argument to say that he's working within a framework which government gave him, inflation targeting, right? But it's important to then go back and ask this question. Firstly, are the processes in parliament sufficient in time and in purpose to allow for democratic participation? And our answer is that it's not. It's a tick box exercise that has not been contested because the ANC has majority. That's how I answer your question. There has to be sufficient time, right, to deal with the money bills and the EFF proposal, which no one has argued against because it would be very difficult to argue against. Let's have one committee, which we already have, Standing Committee on Finance, that process the fiscal framework and the other money bills in taxation. The Standing Committee on Appropriation is there. It's all good. It deals with appropriation bill and division of revenue bill. We need another committee in parliament that is called a portfolio committee on treasury. What does it do? It called Duncan, come here, sit. How are you running this treasury? That's what we need. So if you do that, it means Dr. Maswanganya and the committee, who's chairing the Standing Committee on Finance now, can have all the time to really engage Budget Coalition, Institute of Economic Justice, and everyone else who says, we have a view on this process of budgeting. Where should that view start? That view should start when the Treasury release what they call terms of reference on how they're going to do the budget, right? Those are released much earlier. Immediately when they finish with the budget, they release them to prepare for the next budget. That's where the Standing Committee on Finance should start getting involved. They must call Budget Coalition and say, these are the framework of this budget. What is your view? We make our input, we send them the treasury. When the treasury start the budget process, those terms of references have been revised. They've taken into account civil society. They've taken into account Parliament Voice, which represent 60 million people through those 500 people. And we are confident that in cycling the budget process, we have been heard from the beginning. When it comes in January, we're not surprised because we made input on the terms of reference. That's how we change the budget process. But there's an important point that Louis made earlier when he was talking about the New Africa judgment, right? Your question on what must change, part of it is the conversation. The conversation must change about not just taxation, about economic policy. What was interesting about a New Africa judgment, it is regulating behavior. You are choosing to buy alcohol at the airport. Johnny Walker, NAC, and all. You are choosing to do it because you have firstly the privilege of being a diplomat. You are flying through OR Tambo or Cape Town International Port or Ushaka, going to Lesotho, Eswatini, and everywhere else that you're going. You have that privilege. Tell me, does a domestic worker has a privilege of not catching a taxi and going to work in the morning and just sit at home? Why would you call that a privilege? Why would you want to regulate that behavior? Because the people have no choice. So the New Africa judgment, it will be a mountain to challenge it. But I think it would be reasonable, and this is what we agree on with our legal team and the leaders of the EFF. It would be reasonable, right, to try and extract some of the taxation from the custom and excise legislation that pretty much stays in the terrain of general taxation. And for levy is one of them, right? The ANC will not have the privilege, as they've had before in the past 30 years, to smuggle in as many of these technical amendments as they did. And let me tell you, there was a guy at the National Treasury, he's now of retirement age, very sharp mathematician, Ishmael Momoniat.
Oh, yeah.
He had the capacity to calm you down in explaining nonsense. And you just have to appreciate that. I mean, remember, Momo went to the Treasury in 1994. We're talking about wealth of knowledge around the institution. You know, 1994 was very young. I was in diapers. The man was in the Treasury. He's a mathematician. He has good people skills. He is willing to listen to your wrong argument and dialectically say to you, okay, Gumani, if I hear what you are saying, and then you say yes. Oh, but by the time you come with this argument, that's how we dealt with Parliament, right? So part of these difficulties that you're experiencing now is because we may not agree, but there's been a brain drain from the Treasury, you know? And this is not a cheap shot at anyone. It's just that it's a complex institution. It needs wealth of history and knowledge. Hence, you will hardly find a study which looks at the history of the Treasury. My doctoral thesis, a very small contribution, was just an introduction. You know that sentence that you write, okay, yeah, I'm going to talk about tax with Chili Boy. That is 5 years of research. And that's what I did. We've not discussed what we discussed here with Chili Boy, just to say what we're going to talk about. That was an entire PhD project. There has to be more conversation about the Treasury from 1910, the changes after the World War II, how did the apartheid government view the Treasury, what was the influence of the Treasury, up until we get to a point where I answer your question, what should change? Because it's going to be very difficult to change how things happen without understanding that history. To assume, Louis, and don't make this mistake as a technical expert, to assume that there are no people at the Treasury who have interest on how they want to shape society. And to just think that these are Democrats, they are willing to hear the majority. This is what Budget Coalition is saying. This is what the Institute of Economic Justice is saying. This is what COSATU is saying, SAF2, the EFF, and says, oh, okay, I think now we've arrived at some point where we can cover everyone. To assume that's how they work and not the other way around, I think it leaves a lot of technically trained people with a conversation that does not talk to me and you, Matshidiso. It just answers papers when they're filed in court, right? But the technical expertise themselves, they have to, at some level, engage economics like a social science that it is. They have to. It's not a natural science that tells you the sun will rise in Bombela and then it will set in Rustenburg. That's not how it works. In social science, it can rise in Cape Town and we can discuss it amongst ourselves.
Okay, maybe let me allow Louis to come in and Matshidiso.
So maybe it's because it's fresh. So I think what I'm hearing you saying then is that essentially we need to understand the institutional culture, as it were, of Treasury, because that is what dictates the policy making behind it. Yeah. Because I think also what we've seen with legislation in general, if you just talk more broadly about the Constitution, is that a lot of legislation, as I understand, you made the point about the private members' bills, starts in cabinet, comes to Parliament, and is then passed. So there is a question, and in tax, this thing comes up also every year because in a month or two, Treasury is going to table the Taxation Laws Amendment Bill, which gives effect to proposals made in the budget. Those documents are going to contain, we're going to get a bill and we're going to get something called explanatory memoranda, which are going to explain the rationale behind it. If you look at the difference, and I'm just going on past years, between the explanatory memorandum, when it's introduced now, the first draft, and at the end, very small differences. Okay, usually. And effectively, that's endorsed by Parliament. That rationale is endorsed by Parliament because it's voted into by Parliament. So this year, we'll see, might be a bit different. But even though Parliament, passes legislation, President signs it, etc., if you look at the rationale from where it started to where it ends, it looks like it was driven by, the Treasury policy. And that's often also how we talk. We talk about what does Treasury want to do. So it's a very valid point.
Maybe allow you, Matshidiso, to come in.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point about, I'll hop on the public participation one because it's work like advocacy we've been doing for years, and this view that economics is just whatever Treasury says it is, that's what it is. But then when you look at the economy, you can see like there's something missing here, something has gone off. And I think one of the suggestions that we've always had was to expand public participation. And I mean, you make the point like the Budget Justice Coalition to present more in Parliament, but I also think, even beyond civil society, because I think there are also like criticisms that we can have, that we as civil society, we also experience the budget in a certain way. We really want the budget to be by the people, for the people. So we want the communities that we engage on who are constantly asking, like whenever they, we make submissions on their behalf, and we're trying to get it to a point where they make submissions directly to Parliament. And the same thing comes up is that this budget is so inaccessible to them, but they're the ones who feel it the most, And so I think one of the ways that we can make democratize the budget is by introducing public participation at the conceptualizing of the budget. So when they open the budget process, so in June, July, like it shouldn't be just an afterthought, which is what we currently have. Right now we have submissions to Parliament, like within, I think the budget will happen, let's say on the last Wednesday in February, then on the Monday, we are presenting to Parliament about this budget. And you know how huge the budget documents are. So it's
very huge.
Yeah, sometimes you might actually miss a fuel levy that goes up, like that's how it doesn't give us enough time to actually, and that's what they've been doing for years, just sneaking things. And I think even the parliamentarians, even the people who are sitting in the committee, they also need time to break down and expand, like, what does it mean? Because it's such a technical document. And I know they make it, like it's an intellectual thing of, I understand the budget, but the budget is supposed to be accessible to everyone, because it literally is like, what's the point of people paying taxes, of sacrificing even the quality, good quality public services because we're paying for debt, because we took on World Bank loans, IMF loans, all of those things, if they don't get a say or they don't, if they can't contribute to it. So we're really calling for some processes, Parliament, Treasury had trialed it before, but they've stopped the pilots, and I don't think they were very interested. But we participated in it, which was pre-budget consultations of what we'd like to see in the budget, what not just we want more money for this, but like explaining the human rights impact on this and the human impact on the budget. So I think that's also another doable way. There is the infrastructure already to make pre-budget consultations. So we'd like to see that. Treasury promised to do that, but I'm not so sure now. I think they're waiting for things to die down a bit. They're looking at the heat is on in the Ministry of Police rather, and so they think they may, so we need to continue to put them under pressure for that, because I think we can be fighting for. We can be fighting things like the fuel levy or VAT increase, but if not that, it'll be something else. Last year, it was budget cuts towards education and health. Persistent, they were not hiring enough doctors, not hiring enough teachers. They're still not doing that, but it's always going to be like this as long as the budget is, Treasury has this level of power without actually engaging with people. I mean, when the VAT increase was introduced and there was backlash, the finance minister was asked about what public participation is, and he was actually shocked. He was like, what do you mean? Do you want us to hold rallies across the country? And it's like, they can't conceptualize what that would mean to shape a budget that's by the people, for the people. And also, like, it's to their benefit as well. They can make better decisions, better informed decisions if they actually engage with the people that they serve. I mean, most people have never engaged with National Treasury, like ever. Like, Treasury does not go and engage with everyday people. Perhaps they rely on the departments, but then they're not working with social departments, they're not, the economic policy and our social policy are not speaking the same language right now in South Africa. It's not speaking the language of poverty alleviation. One may be saying that, but the other isn't. So one is like debt management or all of these other technical terms. And I think they're also, South Africans are incredibly bright and intelligent and know the public sector that they're utilizing rather. And I think that if Treasury actually engaged with the public and went to communities and heard what people have to say, they might actually find some really great ideas how to solve the fiscal crisis that we have.
You want to come in?
Yeah. No. So, when you say something has gone off, that's what Matshidiso is saying. And excuse the language. When something smells off, unless you say what is it that smells off, you will not understand it. It could very well be an old Evo that has gone rotten, right? And then once you pick it up and say, oh, okay, it's an old Evo. When you say something has gone off in relation to the budget, in relation to VAT increase debates, fuel levy debates, you need to say there are more than 12 million unemployed people. This economy that the Treasury has the responsibility to manage has not grown in the past 10 years. Right? They have not been able to grow the economy and create jobs. This budget that we're debating, which they denied for many years, was an austerity budget. The minister comes and says, this time around, we concede austerity budget has not worked. This is not an austerity budget going forward. He conceded in that. If you read the second budget and then the argument that was made, but more polished in the third budget, right? When you say something has gone off, you need to say those things so that you are able to then contextualize the ability or inability of the institutions and the individuals that are responsible for this. And I want to read something quickly, Chilibo, if you allow me.
You can.
So Keynes, right? I'm just looking at it. Keynes in 1918, he's talking about the British Treasury, which is pretty much the same as ours, right? Because of colonization, the British rule in South Africa for a very long time. He says, the aloofness of the Treasury was not a piece of old-fashioned obscenity, but a part of ritual for the preservation of the prestige of the department. Why do you need to preserve the prestige? So that at that time, you could impose something called Treasury View. And what was the Treasury View? The Treasury View in South Africa, the late Vish Padayach talks about it. One of the only few people that talks about it, because what does it say? The Treasury has a certain ideological leaning. What is that ideological leaning? Don't spend public money because you run a risk of crowding private investment. That is Treasury View. Treasury View becomes what makes the foundation of what Margaret Thatcher later implemented, which is what we famously call neoliberalism in political language. I don't think people understand pretty much what is neoliberalism the way they should. But if you explain the characteristics, they don't know what you're talking about pretty much. And they can even tell it to someone else, oh, Gumani says that's called neoliberalism. But it involves the following things, right? Yeah. So when we talk about the culture of the institution, cultural behavior, we must not also remove individuals that form part and parcel of perpetuating this culture that makes things to go off. Because there must be some responsibility, right? And that responsibility will only come when you know that something has gone off, it smells, and then you go and find it. You don't try and describe the smell because that's very dangerous. You know, two things can smell the same when they've gone off. And they're not the same thing, you know? But they can, here, we don't have the privilege of smelling this has gone off. We need to find it and fix it. And I'm one of the people who argue a lot, Louis, that taxation law, fiscal policy, and economic policy in general, I'm one of the people who argue that it is being made to come across as some complex, sophisticated, difficult subject. But Matshidiso is correct. It's a very simple conversation. Do you have money for petrol there? You have. How much? 600. Okay. Judging by the automobile you drive, you're going to get some mileage. Maybe not more than me, but you're going to get something. That's the conversation about the economy, right? What we think is complex, and I admit, is the administrative part of it. When you have to administrate a 14%, 15% VAT across the entire economy, that needs some brains. That needs SARS. You need engineering processes, you need mathematicians, you need people who have studied not economics, but mathematics of economics, right? That's different, right? So you have an academia in South Africa that has been hijacked. And I make this argument here, I make it in the EFF, and I make it in academia everywhere I go. The economics that people are being taught is not economics. I call it financial sector management, something. That's why everyone else who have studied economics end up at ABSA, FNB, BlackRock, maybe SARS, Treasury somewhat, Reserve Bank. These are people who administrate the decisions of economics. But if you want to talk the serious, hard reality of the informal settlement in Kailicha, in Nyanga, in Olivet, where I live down the road, 5 people were killed this past weekend. And it doesn't look strange. That is the economics of society. That's what gets taught not in one subject, but intersectionally across different subjects. Gender studies, sociology, engineering, medicine. And then you have to look at how do you then put this thing together so that when you talk about a fuel levy increase and its implication, Louis, specializing in tax administration legally, can tell you with this appreciation of what happened where I live in Oliven, where 5 people got killed. Last point. There's been a comment that was made by some senior official in the Navy who went to Parliament and say, the reason why we are where we are today, the National Treasury is messing up. And what does the National Treasury do? They respond with a statement, 4 paragraphs. The general is wrong. We don't make the decisions. Parliament make the decisions. We make the technical proposal. That tells you there's a deliberate cultural behavior of wanting to be aloof. Because a reasonable answer by a Director General of a Treasury should have been, we are going to ask the minister to assist us to facilitate dialogue and engagements with both Parliament and the defense. We need to understand, go back to all the defense reviews that have been made, go back to the demands of society today, that those reviews may be outdated, and look at whether we are spending enough on defense or not. That, for me, invite engagement, says that you are willing to look at the mistakes that have been made, not by you, by everyone in the system, and then you can reconsider. That takes serious intellectual investment, not on the administration of a political decision, but in understanding society, which is why we don't talk about economics. We talk about the political economy. That's important.
Wow. Okay.
Can I
yes,
quickly,
please come.
I think it's just important, Dr. Gumani's point about the way economics is taught and understood, because this point has actually come up before. There's actually a documentary that was 2011 actually won Best Oscar, and I forgot, the name escapes me now, but Matt Damon is the narrator, where they talk about the effect, what led to the 2008 crash, the economic crash. And what they explain there is they say that the teaching of economics, the view has been corrupted. This is 13, 14 years ago. This was brought up. In the US context, the teaching of economics has been corrupted. It's the cause for massive inequality, etc. You can also see in the UK now, there's a former, where was he a bank? It's a former Citibank trader, a guy by the name of Gary Stevenson, who started the page called Gary's Economics, where he talks about this and he's trying to explain to people and that. So, and he's got more than 1 million followers on YouTube. So the view about the kind of economics being taught, and this conversation has been going on for a while, actually. Yeah.
Maybe in closing, I'm mindful of time now. Maybe Louis, maybe take us through the practical challenges that this uncertainty, this thing of not being sure of if Treasury have got powers or the Parliament delegated powers when it comes to tax rate changes. What's happening practically? Maybe simplify it for us to say practical. These are the challenges that we're experiencing.
Yeah. So, the practical challenge is the uncertainty, and the effect. And I think Dr. Gumani touched on that. The issue with VAT and a few levies, where if you have the announcement, you allow for this 12-month period for the legislation to pass. What can happen? It depends on the type of tax, and I don't want to get too technical. But VAT and the fuel levy are the ones where it impacts you. So I buy petrol, the 16 cent is added. I buy a product where VAT is at, what was the rate they were going to impose? I think 15.5%. I buy that, 15.5% is baked into the price. Okay. There's no way for me to get that back. I pay it. Now, after the 12 months, the legislation isn't passed. I'm out of pocket. They can't go back. There's no way for me to get it back. With other taxes, it's possible. Like with income tax, for example, if they adjust the rate because I'm going to submit an income tax return, I can get a refund. But on VAT, I can't get a refund. Only a VAT vendor can get a refund, someone registered for VAT. And on the fuel levy, only if I'm, for example, registered for excise tax, can I get a refund. And then there are some sectors, I don't think we'll have time for that, but it would be interesting to discuss. There are some sectors that could qualify for a fuel levy rebate. But again, farming, which is one. But again, that takes time because you've got to submit and there's lots of cases that have gone to court also now where these refunds are delayed. People might have heard Eskom also had a fight with the SARS, about a 3 billion rand refund about a year or two ago. So practically, it depends on the type of tax, the impact, and whether you can recover the monies. I think the solution, and I hope I'm answering your question, and please correct me if I'm not, but I think the solution is to simplify this and to find a way. And perhaps the answer is, I think, in starting the budget process earlier, because if there is input, if you get, say, and I'm just throwing up a number here, but if the Budget Justice Coalition,
correct.
If the Budget Justice Coalition and other entities have an opportunity to provide input in that, by the time the budget is given in Feb, yes, we know that we want the rate changes to come into effect in 6 weeks' time on 1 April. But there's been significant progress made on the conversation, on the consultation process. So maybe we don't have 100% of Parliament, but maybe we have 60, 70, 80. I'm making up a number, but the point is, I think it's about navigating the process. So we'll see what happens in the Part B cases, but those cases are important because they bring attention to the fact that something does need to change. I think.
Yes.
I think something needs to change. It's too confusing. It's not clear enough. Whatever Treasury's intentions might be, there needs to be greater clarity. Yeah.
I mean, it's too confusing even for us technocrats who apply tax.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember this when we were still doing our honors, how confusing that was. But I mean, where to now? Part B? I think the Part B, if we can see Part B going through and being finalized, perhaps it's going to come up with this certainty within the whole application of the changes in tax rates and the powers be. Where to now?
Well, I think the greater part of the conversation will not rely on the legal challenges. The greater part of the conversation will depend on the further developments of the budget. Unfortunately for us, we're having this conversation just 3 days before the appropriation bill passed.
Yes, yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's the unfortunate part. But we have now a parliament that is nicely positioned with differing views across the board, where there's going to be a need for greater consensus. And the greater consensus will have to be based on views. I don't say rational views, because we're dealing with a very irrational conversation in its nature. Frantz Fanon talks about colonization and challenging it. Yesterday marked a centenary of his birth. And that's a feat for such an intellectual giant. So when he talks about, you will not challenge coloniality through some rational viewpoint. It's what we have now. But in seeking greater consensus, Chili Boy, it means that your views are your views, but you must have some degree of willingness to listen to the other view. And it may not always depend on the number of seats you have, but it will sometimes have to depend on how far are you willing to concede and accept the other party's viewpoint. One being, who in their right mind will disagree with the viewpoint from a Budget Justice Coalition to say, perhaps let's submit the presentation on the budget before the minister tables the MTPPS and the MTBPS, the medium-term budget policy statement, because it's a precursor of the budget. We should have put together certain things already so that by April, when the new financial year starts, we already have certainty, the point that Louis is making. That point is not ideological. It's just simply administrative, and then it will clarify a lot of confusion. That's the way forward. But last point, the kind of economics that South Africa have, the kind of society which we all want to see, will not depend on one manifesto of one political party, right? Because no one must claim that they have superior knowledge more than all of us. But there has to be an openness to agreeing to say that actually we don't see a way past this unemployment rate unless the state invests in industrialization. Don't be liberal about it. Be rational about it. in an unrational environment. That's my last point.
It depends if you ask Harry, what's his surname? Capitec? There's that dog comment.
Oh, yeah.
That's an entire conversation.
That's another conversation.
It's not about text. It's not about text.
No.
It's about influence, right? And Louis, I want you to go and look at a Mail and Guardian opinion piece I did about Stats SA and funding some time back, before this whole debacle.
Okay.
And I was making a simple argument. If you defund Stats SA like they did, and you hollow out its expertise.
Good point.
Right? This was before the CEO of Capitec said, I think the unemployment must be 10%. Based on what? Which method? Based on the accounts that you have. One day we must talk about the history of Capitec properly. Right? But if you look at that article, the argument I made is if you defund Stats SA, you run a risk of allowing people to attack its credibility and the credibility of the data. And I'm happy that the Statistician General, Risenga Maluleke, stand firm, told them, you are wrong, you don't have methodology. We follow international framework on how we collect data. And on a simple factual issue, we do include informal statistics. And if you look at the quarterly labor survey, go to this page, you will find it. I was very happy about that. I don't know why the minister in the presidency, Khumbudzo Ntshavheni, felt the need to invite the CEO of Capitec to sit with Stats SA. But if you have that balance sheet and you're one of the 6 banks in South Africa, well, pretty much have the power to call anyone to sit with you.
Yeah.
Matshidiso, where to?
Yeah, so the Stats SA one, that was a very interesting and important point because it shocked us to see the new Capitec CEO
Of the outgoing.
discredits the Stats SA data. And I think it's what was even more shocking to me is seeing that meeting. If I'm not mistaken, that meeting, like Treasury, Stats SA, all of them went to the CEO, and I was like, oh, so you guys can do engagement.
Yeah, absolutely.
They can do it.
You know, and DT, I see a couple of them.
They can do it. And so it's like, okay, fine. Maybe that's one person who may have to be corrected. But what about engaging with the rest of this country? And I think another issue that I think we really are seeing is that there's been a few people who have been disassociated from the budget process. And I think a lot of people haven't seen the taxes and the budget as their money, right? But I do think that this year, with all this conversation, with the change, like everything that's been happening in parliaments, I just hope that people in this country keep the momentum. Yes, you don't have to necessarily be, like the technical skill of formulating a budget. There are people who are doing that, and are doing it very well. But even just the lived experience and how you experience public services, that is important. How you experience the economy, that really matters. And people need to hold that and take their views as really important, and also engage with these parliament processes. Yes, civil society, Budget Justice Coalition, Section 27, we make submissions to parliament.
Don't forget Shili Boy. I mean, I'm part of the conversation.
You're having us here. Because
I'm giving you a platform.
And you make submissions to parliament. But I think I would love to see those submissions predominantly by community members, daily people saying, you know what, we heard this about the budget. How does this budget, like more engagement. And yes, there's a role that Parliament has, there's a role that Treasury has in public participation. But I also hope that for especially young people in South Africa, that you're ready also for a time where we actually do build a budget process that actually works for people in this country. So the disillusionment, I think, is also intentional, that people, if they step back from the budget process, then Treasury has more power. But if you actually engage and think about it and also take ownership of it, that it is your money. Like when you're paying these taxes, whether it's like taking a taxi or your income taxes, whatever it is, like that is your money and you have a right and you should be taking ownership of it. And also just maybe the last thing to say is that there have been wins in the process this year. I think this year, one of the big things is that we wrote a letter to one of the committees in Parliament and asked them, like more public participation, clearly, because if they did, there wouldn't be a 2% VAT, there wouldn't be 3 budget iterations. That's a form of backdated public participation in some way. There was something missing there. And so what they then did is that they had public hearings on the budget for the first time, I think, in South African history, in Limpopo, outside of Parliament. And so, there is power in that. And I think we shouldn't just let it go. We should continue to call for that, because there are many people who had never even heard of the Division of Revenue Bill were now engaging directly with Musi Maimane and telling him about how they're experiencing it. And they're honestly, like, the inputs there are just as meaningful as the inputs from Treasury. So don't underestimate your experience. Your experiential knowledge is also good enough to engage in the public in the budget process.
Happy with that. Okay. Thank you so much, Louis and Dr. Gumani and Matshidiso for joining us. I hope that we'll certainly have these conversations going forward. I mean, like I said, the Tax Awareness Podcast is primarily focused on National Treasury. And
absolutely.
Yeah, and the working of the National Treasury and the administration part, which is SARS. So let's zoom in. Let's have this dialogue. And I'm happy that, they're saying they're going to open the consultative processes from September. Hopefully, and we'll be monitoring that, we'll be engaging with the likes of you to say, are they going on? The EFF and other political parties will invite them. Let's have conversation around the working of National Treasury. And you just gave me a hint of my PhD. I've been looking for I've been looking for something to do with PhD. I'm like, where can I research? I need a PhD.
But there must be passion.
No. That's why I'm saying you gave me something around fiscal policies, because that's why I'm zooming in to say, what is it that I can find within the fiscal policies? So you just gave me the whole history of I don't know if I'll get the literature around that. That might be an issue there, but we'll see that. But thank you so much, colleagues, for joining me. My name is Shilibo Mutiba. I hope you enjoyed. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your colleagues the Tax Awareness Show, a platform where we really focus on the fiscal policies of the country. Thank you so much for watching.